All right, let's start the next part of our lecture. We are on slide 7, the invention of writing and logical thought. Once again, now that I figured out I can use my sewing machine to hold up the phone, it's great. All right, so writing and reading, which this is a fun historical fact because why not, as also like a historical interpreter and reenactor. For much of history, a lot of people didn't know how to do both of those things. In fact, scribes were often hired to only write and copy words, but didn't know how to read them. So that's interesting. But let's think about what happens when you know how to do both of those things, because they are cognitively different skill sets, and knowing how to read and write together pretty important for human cognition. So reading and writing, especially when we think about writing, it's basically involving symbols. You know, we think on slide 8, it talks about, you know, symbolic representation and thought. For tens of thousands of years, humans have used symbolic thought. You know, when you think about in chapter 1, when we talked about these cave paintings of horses, that was symbolic thought that took working memory skill, long-term memory, that took creativity and a lot of higher order cognition. Writing and reading is an example of this, using symbolic thought. But there was a very large gap of time between seeing the symbolic art and actual writing to put down our exact thoughts into written word. So when we look at slide 9, the first writing showed up a little over 5,000 years ago in about 3200 BCE. This was in Mesopotamia and known as cuneiform. I hope you guys learned a little bit about that back in, you know, middle school, high school. But this was often written into clay tablets. And, you know, it was, you know, our first real glance at an alphabet that phonetically broke down speech so that we could carry thought for a long period of time. Writing was often used as a system of tokens by Neolithic farmers during that time in Mesopotamia. They used it to track food commodities. It was used for accounting. The Greek alphabet, which appeared thousands of years later after cuneiform, Greek alphabet appeared in about 750 BCE, was also, you know, phonetic and could represent that spoken language. And this helped have a minimal load on memory. So we know from looking at the cognitive load of different languages that are written that when you have a phonetic language that it is easier, there's less cognitive load than if you have writing that is representational. So for an example of this, you can think of a language like German, where each letter represents one sound, or two letters put together will always equal a specific sound. So if you look at writing, even if you don't know what it means, you always know how to pronounce the word. English is unfortunately not like this. However, on the opposite spectrum as well, you have, it's not even considered an alphabet system when you have something like, say, Mandarin Chinese, where each character represents a different word. And so you have to memorize hundreds or thousands of specific characters to represent each piece of vocabulary. And so it's considered more cognitively difficult to learn that as a writing system. So phonetic languages and alphabets, especially the Greek alphabet, kind of paved the road for other alphabets to follow in much of kind of the Western world. And given, the brain's capacity for symbolic thought and oral language and the whole oral culture that builds from that, it's thought that writing was going to be inevitable because it's so much more efficient than what we had before. So think about in your own life how much writing is efficient. How often do you text people? How often do you send emails? How often do you write yourself notes for things that you need to pick up from maybe the grocery store? All of these are examples of efficiency where maybe we don't have the capacity within long-term memory or working memory to hold all the information we need. So moving on to slide 10, the mental organ of writing. Your brains, I guess your hand as well, but we're talking about the mental organ. So we see the effects of the invention of writing in how the brain functions, in the mind, and the different societies that we interact with and we live in. So for instance, becoming a fluid reader, and becoming fluent in reading the language that you speak is a pretty big deal. It's highly emphasized in our education system, and it's very difficult to operate in society if you can't read. If any of you have ever traveled abroad to a place where you didn't speak the language, you probably quickly realized how difficult it was just to navigate basic systems without having that fluency. So, becoming that fluent reader entails training a lot of different cognitive networks within the brain to recognize the different, writing that we see, and to comprehend what it actually means. So there are many systems happening. So initially, the primary visual cortex within the occipital lobe processes a word. Then the fusiform gyrus in your left hemisphere is activated, and that's what triggers this series of activations throughout the brain. So you're taking the word in through the eyes, goes to the occipital lobe, then it's going to the fusiform gyrus in your left hemisphere. This area is known as the word area, or word form area, and it shows more activation in response to a string of letters that form a valid word in your language, or plausible words, so words that could look like a word in your language, than invalid non-words. So for instance, this area is going to be activated more for a real word. It's going to be activated for a word that follows the grammatical rules of your language, but is meaningless. But it's not going to be as activated for a non-word that, maybe it doesn't have any vowels, or maybe the consonants are in an order that doesn't make any sense for your language. So it really kind of knows what makes sense and what doesn't for your particular language. And then with other forms of visual stimuli, the fusiform gyrus is pretty important for chunking together features and integrating them into a whole. For instance, it does this for faces, unless you are face blind. So not surprisingly, it also chunks, letters, which are little components, into words. And this is what allows for the processing of words as a person reads. So on slide 11, we continue with the mental organ of writing. So children's ability to discriminate among phonemes. So remember that phonemes are tiny little pieces of speech or little sounds. Predicts the ease with which reading is learned. So they've got to be able to pick apart those letters, those sounds, to be able to read. And we've kind of touched on this earlier in the semester when we were first looking at phonemes and morphemes. But this is really, you've got to be able to know the most basic part of reading. So, you know, a child's ability to discriminate among, like, say, the basic building blocks of oral language, you know, predicts how easy it is to read. So even between 6 and 10 months, sound distinctions that don't matter in a child's native language are lost. So this is where, you know, those phonemes that you hear within that first year are really, really important. And if you're not hearing phonemes that are outside of your mother language, you're just not going to end up learning them. The brain does not consider them as important. It's going to end up neural pruning out those phonemes. So there's a region in the left posterior part of the brain near the fusiform gyrus, and it records visual letters into sounds of language when children learn. So I want you guys to kind of think back to when you were first learning how to read, and how you were kind of placing words and the individual letters into sounds as we go through this. So there's also an interior region of the left hemisphere that's overlapping with Broca's area, and it handles the articulation of sounds. So it's involved with the phonological loop, so sounds repeating in the phonological loop, and the inner voice of the interpreter. And when people pay attention to the meaning of a word, they show activation in the frontal semantic area of the brain, just interior to Broca's area. And meanwhile, there's also something that happens while people process numbers. So not only letters, but numbers. The brain shows even more adaptation to the learning experience of a literate upbringing when examining studies of how the brain processes numbers. So this is even like a step higher than letters. And the brain processes numbers differently on whether the numbers are presented visually as standard Arabic digits or spelled out words. So you can kind of think about why that's the case. When you have just a number, like say, you know, the number 3, that was backwards for you guys, the number 3, that's a symbol for the number. But if you were to spell out the word 3, that is going to go through the brain in a different network than for just the digit. So digits are not processed as reading, but as pictures. So symbolic pictures, which computations carried out in the parietal cortex. So what's interesting about this is if you've ever noticed while doing like just strict like algebraic math homework as maybe a high schooler or something, that it was easier to maybe listen to music or conversation or something at the same time than it was for other types of homework. Maybe it was because you were literally using a different network pathway of your brain that was not as involved in reading as it was in processing picture information. So something kind of neat. All right. So looking at slide 12 here, narrative and logical thought. So you guys tell stories, we tell stories. Even me telling this lecture is a narration, is hopefully logical. We try to make it logical, but you know, things can get tangled. But narrative thought is part of spoken language. And prior to the development of writing, all communication was carried out through our spoken language and body language and visual expressions, which takes a form of a narrative story, both in our minds as well as our speech. And it was used to convey these foundational beliefs or truths about the world. So, you know, our myths and our stories, our culture, our parables and fairy tales, our religions. And the interpreter provides the machinery for storytelling. So we use our inner voice to help explain different events in terms of causes and consequences, and narrative structure is imposed on the experience. And the inner story is shared using oral culture that we spoke about many chapters ago. And quite often, oral stories were told in a group and then shared by others. And there are many communities today that have oral traditions and stories that have been shared generation to generation to generation for even up to thousands of years. It's believed that Aboriginal people of Australia, in fact, have stories that may have been told for up to 50,000 years in an oral tradition. So some of these stories are extremely long-lasting, and to the point where we can't even verify if that's truly how long it's been. It's just that the stories mention animals that we know have been extinct for that long, and everyone, you know, within the archaeological and, you know, scientific community doesn't really know what to do by this point with figuring out how long some of these stories have truly been in place. But storytelling is so much a part of our culture. It's how we interact with each other. It's how we meet up, you know, after work and, you know, gossip or tell about what happened that day, or talk about, you know, things that happened in the past when we're reminiscing about high school or whatever. And storytelling is a constant part of our entertainment, whether it's through TV or books or Twitter threads about wild, crazy things that happen to people, or podcasts. And it's all possible due to writing. So we are going to pick up in the next video on slide 13, where we'll talk a bit more about narration and logical thoughts, maybe even illogical thought, and then continue through and see where we get. So see you then.